On a crisp November morning in 1957, passengers dressed in their finest travel attire gathered at San Francisco International Airport, ready to embark on what was advertised as the most luxurious flight experience of their era. The aircraft waiting for them gleamed on the tarmac, a double-decked marvel of aviation engineering that represented everything glamorous about flying in the golden age of air travel. They called her the Clipper Romance of the Skies, and she promised to carry them across the Pacific in unprecedented comfort, sipping champagne and dining on elaborate 7-course gourmet meals. Within hours, all 44 souls aboard would vanish into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, triggering the largest air-sea search operation in the history of that ocean. What happened during those final minutes remains one of aviation's most haunting mysteries, a puzzle filled with suspicious insurance policies, changed wills, elevated carbon monoxide levels in recovered bodies, and a flight that continued for 23 minutes after its last routine radio transmission without ever sending a distress call. This is the story of Pan Am Flight 7, a tale of luxury turned to tragedy, of families left without answers, and of investigators who would spend decades trying to determine whether they were investigating an accident or a murder that killed 44 people at once. The Golden Age of Aviation. To understand what happened on November 8, 1957, we must first transport ourselves back to a very different era of commercial aviation. The year 1957 existed in that brief, shining moment between the end of World War II and the dawn of the jet age. Propeller-driven aircraft still ruled the skies, and flying remained the exclusive province of the wealthy and important. A one-way ticket from San Francisco to Honolulu cost $300, equivalent to well over $3,000 in today's money. Pan American World Airways stood as the undisputed king of international air travel. Founded by Juan Terry Tripp, a Yale-educated businessman with grand visions, Pan Am had built its reputation on luxury, reliability, and pushing the boundaries of what aviation could achieve. The airline's clipper ships had once been flying boats, landing on water in exotic harbors around the world. By 1957, Pan Am operated land-based aircraft, but they maintained that spirit of adventure and elegance, treating every flight as if passengers were embarking on an ocean voyage through the sky. Pan Am Flight 7 represented one of the airline's most ambitious offerings, a round-the-world service that departed from San Francisco, heading westward with 15 intermediate stops before eventually arriving in Philadelphia on the opposite coast. Passengers could board for the entire journey or disembark at any of the scheduled stops. The trip from San Francisco to Honolulu represented just the first leg of this global adventure, but it was perhaps the most important, carrying passengers over 2,400 miles of open ocean, with nothing but water below should anything go wrong. The aircraft assigned to this prestigious route was a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, registration number N909944. Boeing had designed the Stratocruiser as the ultimate expression of propeller-driven luxury, deriving it from the C-97 Stratofreighter military transport, which itself traced its lineage back to the legendary B-29 Super Fortress bomber. The Stratocruiser represented Boeing's answer to the question, what would happen if we took proven military technology and transformed it into a flying palace? The results were spectacular. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser stood as the largest and most luxurious airliner of its time. The double-decker design featured spacious seating on the main deck, with seats that could recline to nearly flat positions, offering 60 inches of legroom. But the truly revolutionary feature lay downstairs, accessed by a spiral staircase, a cocktail lounge where passengers could socialize, share drinks, and enjoy the camaraderie of air travel as if they were in a fine Manhattan bar. Pan Am had christened this particular aircraft Clipper Romance of the Skies, continuing their tradition of giving evocative names to their fleet. Built in 1948, She had been flying for 9 years by November 1957, accumulating 23,690 hours in the air. Her 4 massive Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp major engines represented the pinnacle of piston engine technology, each engine featuring 28 cylinders arranged in 7 rows of 4, producing 3,500 horsepower on takeoff when water injection was engaged. These engines, nicknamed corncobs because their cylinder heads resembled rows of kernels, were the most powerful piston aircraft engines ever produced. The Stratocruiser measured 110 feet and 4 inches long, with a wingspan of 141 feet and 3 inches. At maximum takeoff weight, she could reach 148,000 pounds. The 4-blade propellers measured 16 feet and 8 inches in diameter, large enough that a grown man could stand beneath them without touching the tips. When all 4 engines roared to life, the sound was unmistakable, a deep, powerful thunder that announced the arrival or departure of something truly impressive. Inside, passengers experienced luxury that would be difficult to find even in first class today. Meals were served on fine china, with real silverware and crystal glasses. The 7-course dinners began with champagne and caviar, followed by dishes that would not be out of place in the finest restaurants. Pullman-style sleeping berths could be arranged for overnight flights. The cabin pressure and heating systems maintained comfortable conditions even at cruising altitudes of 10,000 feet or higher. By all accounts, flying on a Stratocruiser represented the height of elegance, the most comfortable way to cross an ocean before the jet age began. Passengers dressed in suits and ties, dresses and high heels, treating the flight as a special occasion worthy of their finest attire. The stewardesses, as flight attendants were called then, wore immaculate uniforms and offered the famous Pan Am smile as they attended to passenger needs with practiced efficiency. But beneath all this luxury and technological achievement, the Stratocruiser harbored dark secrets. The massive engines that powered these aircraft pushed the limits of what piston technology could safely achieve. The enormous propellers that converted engine power into thrust operated under tremendous stress. And by November 1957, a troubling pattern had emerged. A troubled aircraft. The Boeing 377. Stratocruiser, for all its luxury and technological advancement, had developed a reputation that contradicted the comfortable experience it offered passengers. Behind the scenes, pilots, mechanics, and airline executives knew that these beautiful aircraft came with serious reliability problems. Industry insiders had begun referring to the Stratocruiser as the best 3-engine airplane ever built, a dark joke acknowledging that these 4-engine aircraft frequently lost power from 1 or more engines during flight. The problems centered primarily on the propellers and the engines that drove them. The original Stratocruisers came equipped with Hamilton standard hydromatic propellers featuring hollow-core steel blades. The engineering theory seemed sound. Hollow blades would be lighter than solid blades, improving efficiency. However, these hollow cores weren't truly hollow. They were filled with neoprene rubber material designed to provide structural support. In practice, the centrifugal forces generated by these massive propellers spinning at high speeds caused the neoprene material to migrate toward the blade tips. This migration created dangerous imbalances. An unbalanced propeller spinning at high speed generates tremendous vibration that can shake an entire aircraft. In the worst cases, these imbalances caused propeller blades to break apart, with pieces of metal flying off at hundreds of miles per hour. Between 1950 and 1955, investigators documented 6 propeller failures on Stratocruisers that resulted in engine separation or near separation from the aircraft. 2 of these incidents resulted in hull loss accidents, meaning the aircraft was completely destroyed. Pan Am alone lost 7 of their 29 Stratocruisers between 1952 and 1959, averaging nearly 1 catastrophic loss per year. The incidents followed a horrifying pattern. On April 29, 1952, Pan Am Flight 202, a stratocruiser named Clipper Good Hope, crashed in the dense Brazilian jungle while en route from Rio de Janeiro to Port of Spain, Trinidad. The aircraft had been flying the third leg of a journey between Buenos Aires and New York when something went catastrophically wrong. When investigators finally located the main wreckage in the remote south of Pará state, they discovered that the number 2 engine and propeller were missing entirely, torn from the aircraft. Examination of the remaining pieces of the engine mount showed that the mounting had failed due to forces beyond its design limits. The probable cause, an unbalanced propeller that shook itself and the engine free from the wing. All 50 passengers and crew died in what became the worst accident involving a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. On July 30, 1955, another Pan Am Stratocruiser suffered a different propeller-related problem while approaching its landing at San Francisco's Idlewild Airport. A severe vibration forced the crew to feather the number 1 propeller, meaning they adjusted the blade angle to reduce drag and prevent further damage. After landing safely, investigators discovered that 12.5 inches of one propeller blade had broken off during flight. The missing piece had been large enough to penetrate the fuselage if it had struck the cabin. Then came the incident that should have served as the most direct warning regarding Clipper romance of the skies. On October 16, 1956, Pan Am Flight 6, operated by the Stratocruiser Sovereign of the Skies, registration N90SA943, encountered engine problems while flying from Honolulu to San Francisco. The aircraft had departed Hawaii at 8:26 in the evening and was approaching the point of equal time, the moment when returning to Honolulu would take as long as continuing to San Francisco, when the number 1 engine began to overspeed. An overspeeding propeller represents one of the most dangerous situations a pilot can face. When the control mechanism fails, the propeller blades rotate to the flattest pitch, like opening a Venetian blind. In this configuration, they offer minimal resistance to the engine, allowing it to spin faster and faster. The increasing rotational speed generates more centrifugal force, which can cause the propeller to literally tear itself apart. Captain Richard Ogg, commanding Flight 6, made the decision to cut off oil supply to the failing engine, hoping to stop its uncontrolled spinning. Eventually, the engine seized, but then something even worse happened. The drive shaft connecting the propeller to the engine broke with a violent thud. The propeller, now completely detached from any control, began to windmill freely in the airstream, creating enormous drag and making the aircraft difficult to control. The crew faced a nightmarish decision. They could not reach San Francisco with the increased drag and reduced power. They did not have enough fuel to return to Honolulu. Their only option was to ditch the aircraft in the Pacific Ocean and hope that the Coast Guard cutter stationed halfway between Hawaii and California could rescue them. Captain Ogg, displaying remarkable airmanship and composure, managed to keep the crippled Stratocruiser flying through the night. The United States Coast Guard maintained a vessel at Ocean Station November, located approximately halfway between the mainland and Oahu, specifically to provide assistance to aircraft experiencing difficulties. The cutter Pontchartrain was on station that night. As dawn broke over the Pacific, Captain Ogg notified Pontchartrain that he was preparing to ditch. The cutter laid out a foam path on the water to help the captain judge his height above the surface. At 6:15 in the morning, Captain Ogg brought the massive Stratocruiser down onto the Pacific at 90 knots with full flaps deployed and landing gear retracted. The ditching was not gentle. Upon touching the water, the aircraft hydroplaned for several hundred yards before one wing struck a swell, causing the plane to rotate nearly 180 degrees. The tail section broke off on impact, but remarkably, all 31 people aboard survived and were rescued by boats from Pontchartrain. The incident became famous as one of the rare successful ditchings of a large aircraft in the ocean. A film based on the event, called Crash Landing, appeared in theaters in 1958. Sovereign of the Skies sank within 22 minutes, preventing a detailed investigation into the engine failures. But the incident highlighted everything dangerous about stratocruiser operations. An initial propeller failure led to an engine overspeeding. The failure to feather the propeller led to a broken drive shaft. The windmilling propeller created so much drag that the aircraft could not maintain altitude even on 3 engines. And the ditching, while successful in terms of saving lives, destroyed the aircraft. The Civil Aeronautics Authority responded by issuing airworthiness directives, mandatory orders requiring specific inspections and repairs. An early 1957 directive addressed the oil transfer bearing problems, warning that propeller shaft oil transfer bearing failures had resulted in several cases where pilots lost control of propellers, making it impossible to feather them. The directive ordered engine inspection and replacement or repair no later than May 31, 1957. But had these repairs been completed on all aircraft? Pan Am faced enormous pressure to keep its stratocruisers flying. The airline had invested heavily in the aircraft type and could not afford to ground the fleet for extended maintenance. Some investigators later questioned whether all required modifications had been properly completed before aircraft returned to service. The aircraft that became Clipper Romance of the Skies, registration N90944, had been built immediately after the aircraft that became Sovereign of the Skies, registration N90943. They were sister ships in the most literal sense, built one right after the other on the Boeing assembly line. When Sovereign of the Skies ditched in October 1956, it should have raised immediate concerns about the readiness of Romance of the Skies. Those concerns appeared justified when, on June 18, 1957, Romance of the Skies suffered a runaway propeller as it departed San Francisco. The crew found themselves facing the same nightmare that had nearly destroyed their sister ship. The pilots could not resolve the situation in the air, could not regain control of the propeller, pitch. They made the decision to turn around and perform an emergency landing back at San Francisco. The landing was successful, and the aircraft was repaired and returned to service. Then, on September 19, 1957, less than 2 months before the fatal flight, the crew of Romance of the Skies heard a loud noise during a flight between San Francisco and Honolulu. The flight engineer and captain described it as sounding like someone had dropped a heavy object, similar to dropping the navigation stool on the flight deck. The crew performed in-flight inspections, but found no abnormalities. They continued to Honolulu and landed without incident. A Pan Am inspector investigated the incident after the flight arrived. His report stated that he had found nothing out of the ordinary and argued that similar noises could be produced during normal activities. The investigation was closed. Romance of the Skies was cleared to continue flying the same route she had been flying, back and forth between San Francisco and Honolulu, carrying passengers who had no idea about the aircraft's troubled history. The passengers and crew, on the morning of Friday, November 8, 1957, 44 people prepared to board Pan Am Flight 7 at San Francisco International Airport. Among them were 36 passengers from diverse backgrounds and 8 crew members who had chosen aviation as their career. Each person had their own story, their own reasons for making this journey, their own hopes for what lay ahead. The cockpit crew consisted of 4 experienced aviators. Captain Gordon H. Brown, 40 years old, commanded the flight. He had been flying for Pan Am since graduating from Northeastern University in 1942, accumulating 11,014 hours of total flight experience, including 674 hours specifically in the Stratocruiser. As the captain, Brown bore ultimate responsibility for the safety of everyone aboard and for all decisions regarding the conduct of the flight. First Officer William P. Wygant, age 37, served as Brown's co-pilot. Wygant had joined Pan Am in 1946 and had logged 7,355 total flying hours, including an impressive 4,018 hours in the Stratocruiser. His experience with this particular aircraft type exceeded that of the captain, making him an invaluable resource during normal operations and especially during any emergency. Second Officer William H. Fortenberry, 35 years old, filled the role of pilot-navigator for the flight. Fortenberry had started with Pan Am in 1951 after graduating from Spartanburg Community College. He had accumulated 2,683 total flight hours, with 1,552 hours in the Stratocruiser. Fortenberry lived in Santa Clara, California, with his wife and young son, Ken, who was 6 years old. Before moving to California, the Fortenberry family had lived in San Mateo, where William played an instrumental role in establishing Shoreview Methodist Church. His wife would later describe how much William loved California, how he considered it a special place. Flight engineer Albert F. Pinataro, the youngest member of the cockpit crew at 26 years old, managed the aircraft's complex systems. Pinataro had joined Pan Am in 1955 and had spent his entire airline career flying the Stratocruiser, accumulating all 1,596 of his total flight hours in this aircraft type. The flight engineer's position required intimate knowledge of the four massive engines, the hydraulic systems, the electrical systems, and all the other mechanical components that kept the aircraft flying. The cabin crew consisted of 4 members. Flight Supervisor John King, also known as Jack, served as the senior cabin crew member. Purser Eugene Crosthwaite, age 46, supervised the stewardesses and ensured all passenger needs were met. Crosthwaite lived in Felton, a small community in Santa Cruz County, California. His role as purser made him responsible for passenger comfort, meal service, and all cabin operations during the flight. And he harbored dark secrets that would later make him a prime suspect in what might have been mass murder. 2 stewardesses completed the cabin crew, Yvonne Alexander and Marie McGrath. McGrath, who lived in Burlingame, California, worked a second job as a substitute teacher during her time off from flying. She had taught at Sunnybray Elementary School in San Mateo, where a young 4th grader named Greg Herkin had been her student. McGrath had shared stories of her adventures with the class, bringing food from the Clipper for a class luau, and telling the children about Hawaii, exotic and fascinating to these California school children. Her warmth and kindness had made a lasting impression on young Greg, who remembered how she had quietly suggested he ditch his buckskin coat that made him stand out as different, helping him fit in with his new classmates after his family moved from Denver. That small act of kindness would connect Greg Herkin to this tragedy for the rest of his life. The 36 passengers represented a cross-section of affluent travelers in 1957 America. Some were traveling for business, others for pleasure or family obligations. The passenger manifest read like a directory of successful, accomplished individuals. The Alexander family occupied 4 seats: Robert S. Alexander, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children, Judy and David. Their presence meant that the young stewardess Yvonne Alexander was working on a flight carrying passengers who shared her last name, though whether they were related remains unclear from historical records. Bruce Clack and Ann Carter Clack were traveling with their 4 children: H. Lee Clack, Scott Clack, Kimmy Clack, and Nancy Marico Clack. The entire family was aboard, 6 people who would never reach their destination. Among the passengers of particular note was Louis Rodriguez, a surgical orderly from San Francisco and father of 3, traveling to his mother's funeral in Honolulu. He was making a journey motivated by grief, flying to pay his respects to the woman who had given him life. Edward Ellis, an executive with McCormick Spices who lived in Hillsborough, California, was traveling to Honolulu to address a United States Chamber of Commerce convention. His business expertise was valued enough that the chamber had asked him to speak to convention attendees. Ruby Kwong, a registered nurse from San Francisco, had resigned from her position just 2 days before the flight. She was traveling to Hong Kong to care for her ailing mother, leaving behind her career to fulfill a family obligation. Fred Choi, a machinery repairman from San Mateo, was making the journey to visit his seriously ill father in Hawaii. Like Rodriguez, Choi was traveling because of family medical needs, hoping to see his father while he still could. Meili Dural represented Turkey among the passengers, while Tomiko Boyd was from Japan. The passenger list included people from Australia and Indonesia as well, reflecting Pan Am's role as a truly international airline connecting the world. The most prominent passenger aboard, in terms of business stature, was a French executive serving as a vice president of Renault, the automotive manufacturer. His presence on the flight represented the kind of high-level business travel that Pan Am specialized in attracting. Also aboard was a United States Air Force major who was reportedly traveling to Burma on a secret mission. The Cold War was at its height in 1957, and American intelligence operations spanned the globe. Whether this officer's mission had any connection to the flight's fate would later fuel conspiracy theories. Gordon Cole was making his first flight ever. He was nervous about flying, anxious about traveling over so much open ocean, but he had purchased his ticket and was determined to make the journey despite his apprehension. Harold Sunderland and Philip B. Sullivan and his wife Bess Sullivan were among the other passengers whose names appear on the memorial that would eventually be erected in their honor. And then there was William Harrison Payne. Payne, 41 years old, came from Scotts Bar, a tiny town in Siskiyou County, California, near the Oregon border. He owned the Roxbury Lodge, a hunting lodge that was losing money and facing foreclosure. Payne had served in the Navy for 22 years, receiving an honorable discharge. During his military service, he had specialized in underwater demolitions as a Navy frogman. He was an expert in explosives. Payne claimed he was flying to Hawaii to collect a debt of $10,000. But the one-way ticket to Honolulu cost more than the amount he was supposedly traveling to collect. Nobody in his family knew the names of the people who allegedly owed him this money. And 3 days before the flight, on November 5, 1957, Payne had purchased 2 life insurance policies totaling $125,000. Then, on November 4th, just 4 days before the flight, Payne had purchased an additional $10,000 double indemnity policy, one that would pay $20,000 in the event of accidental death. His wife Harriet was named as the beneficiary on all policies. Payne had a history of violent behavior. He had previously been in trouble with the law for trying to collect tolls on a public road used by logging trucks. When threatened with arrest, he had set off a dynamite charge in the road, making it unusable. He had fired 3 shots at a business associate for reasons nobody could determine. And he had been overheard boasting that he could build a delayed action detonator using only a length of wire and 2 flashlight batteries. William Harrison Payne's body would never be found among the wreckage recovered from the Pacific Ocean. His presence aboard Flight 7, with his demolitions expertise, financial desperation, and freshly purchased insurance policies, would make him a prime suspect in theories that the crash was deliberate. But Payne was not the only person aboard that flight whose behavior before departure raised serious questions. Eugene Crosthwaite, the purser, was what we might today recognize as a deeply troubled individual. He had been a widower for only 3 months. His wife had died in August 1957. His relationship with his adopted stepdaughter, Tanya, was reportedly stormy and troubled. Local police in his hometown of Felton knew about these troubles. Some officers had even referred to Crosthwaite as psycho because of his erratic behavior and treatment of his daughter. Less than a week before the flight, on approximately November the 2nd or 3, Crosthwaite called the county sheriff's office and blamed Tanya for his wife's death. What specific accusations he made are not entirely clear from historical records, but the call disturbed law enforcement enough that they documented it. Then, on the morning of November 8, 1957, approximately 1 hour before Pan Am Flight 7 was scheduled to depart, Crosthwaite changed his will. The new will disinherited Tanya unless she lived a moral and upright Catholic life. The language suggested judgment, condemnation, and an attempt to control his daughter's behavior even from beyond the grave. Crosthwaite made a copy of this new will and placed it in the glove box of his car, which he then parked at the San Francisco airport. The act of leaving a copy of a changed will in a parked car, where it would certainly be found if anything happened to him, suggested that Crosthwaite knew he was not coming back. Or, at the very least, it suggested a man who was contemplating his own death. But there was more. Crosthwaite's father-in-law later told investigators that several days before the flight, Crosthwaite had shown him a handful of blasting powder. The older man remembered this clearly. After the crash, when investigators came asking questions, the father-in-law mentioned the blasting powder. Investigators searched Crosthwaite's property exhaustively. They never found any explosives. Crosthwaite also had a long history of conflicts with Pan Am. He blamed the airline for having contracted tuberculosis years earlier, when he served as a purser on Pan Am flying boats in Shanghai before World War II. He felt the airline had not treated him well, had not shown him proper respect, had not compensated him adequately for his service and suffering. He once bragged to colleagues that he had deliberately dropped a meal on the galley floor before serving it to a captain he felt had insulted him. So, as Flight 7 prepared for departure on November 8, 1957, it carried not just 44 people, but a collection of motivations, histories, and psychological states that would later make investigators wonder whether they were investigating an accident or something far more sinister. The flight. At 11:51 in the morning Pacific Standard Time on November 8, 1957, Pan Am Flight 7 departed San Francisco International Airport. The weather was perfect, clear skies with good visibility. The Clipper Romance of the Skies was loaded to its maximum takeoff weight of 147,000 pounds. She carried enough fuel for approximately 13 hours of flight, 3 hours more than the planned 10 hours and 15 minutes to Honolulu. The flight plan called for a cruising altitude of 10,000 feet and an airspeed of 226 knots, equivalent to 260 miles per hour. This altitude and speed represented the optimal balance between fuel efficiency and passenger comfort for the Stratocruiser. Higher altitudes required more fuel to reach, while lower altitudes meant flying through more turbulent air and consuming fuel less efficiently. The four massive Pratt & Whitney engines spun their enormous propellers, pulling the Stratocruiser into the sky. Captain Brown, First Officer Wygant, Second Officer Fortenberry, and Flight Engineer Pinataro worked through their departure checklist, monitoring instruments and making the adjustments that would take them from ground operations to cruise flight. As Romance of the Skies climbed away from the California coast and headed out over the Pacific, the passengers settled into what promised to be a comfortable journey. The cabin crew began their service, offering drinks and preparing for the elaborate 7-course meal that would be served later in the flight. Some passengers may have descended the spiral staircase to visit the lower deck lounge, enjoying cocktails and conversation in that unique social space. Others remained in their seats, reading, talking, or simply gazing out the windows at the vast expanse of water below. For the first several hours, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The Stratocruiser flew on course, maintaining its assigned altitude, burning fuel at the expected rate. The weather remained favorable. The engines ran smoothly. There was no indication that anything was wrong. The United States Coast Guard maintained Ocean Station November at the approximate halfway point between the mainland and Oahu. The cutter Pontchartrain was on station that day, the same vessel that had rescued the passengers and crew of Sovereign of the Skies just over a year earlier. Pontchartrain's crew performed multiple functions at their station. They provided weather reports, they relayed radio messages for aircraft, they stood ready to provide assistance if needed, and they could perform radar surveillance to track passing flights. At 5:04 Pacific Standard Time, approximately 5 hours and 13 minutes after departure, Captain Brown made a routine position report to Pontchartrain. This was standard procedure for transoceanic flights. At that time, Romance of the Skies was 1,028 nautical miles east of Hawaii, approximately 10 miles east of the Coast Guard cutter. The aircraft was on course and on schedule. Captain Brown reported cruising at 10,000 feet and encountering headwinds of approximately 14 miles per hour, mild winds that would have only a minor effect on their arrival time. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Pontchartrain had obtained a radar fix on Romance of the Skies, confirming the aircraft's position. Everything appeared normal. The crew gave no indication of any problems. The tone of the radio transmission at 5:04 p.m. was routine, professional, unremarkable. Just another position report on another flight across the Pacific. Flight 7 was scheduled to make its next position report at 6:04 Pacific Standard Time, 1 hour after the previous report. The radio operator aboard Pontchartrain waited for the transmission. The scheduled time came and went. No call came from Romance of the Skies. Initial delays in radio transmission were not necessarily cause for alarm. Radio equipment could malfunction. Atmospheric conditions could interfere with signals. Perhaps the crew was dealing with a minor technical issue and would call when they had resolved it. But as more time passed, concern began to grow. At 6:12 Pacific Standard Time, having heard nothing from Flight 7 for over 2 hours, Pan Am officials notified the United States Coast Guard that the aircraft had not made its scheduled position report. The airline requested that search efforts begin. The Coast Guard immediately dispatched search aircraft to fly along the route where Romance of the Skies should have been. At 6:42, after another 90 minutes had passed with no word from the missing Stratocruiser, the Coast Guard expanded the search, sending additional aircraft to cover a wider area. At 3 in the morning on November 9th, Robert Murray, Pan Am's Executive Vice President of the Pacific Alaska Division, made the announcement that everyone had feared. By that time, all the fuel aboard Romance of the Skies would have been consumed. The aircraft was down somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The focus shifted from locating a missing aircraft to searching for survivors and wreckage. What had happened during those final minutes? Why had the crew not sent a distress call? The last words from Captain Brown indicated everything was normal. Then, approximately 23 minutes later, based on watches found on victims that had stopped around 5:26 to 5:27 Pacific Standard Time, the aircraft hit the water. 23 minutes is not a long time, but it is long enough to send a radio message. It is long enough to declare an emergency. It is long enough to describe what is going wrong. But no distress call came. Or did it? The search. The disappearance of Pan Am Flight 7 triggered what became, at that time, the largest peacetime air-sea search operation in Pacific Ocean history. The scale exceeded even the massive hunt for Amelia Earhart when she vanished 20 years earlier in 1937. Every available resource was mobilized to find the missing Stratocruiser and, hopefully, survivors. The United States Coast Guard took the lead in coordinating the search. They were joined by the United States Navy, the United States Air Force, and even commercial airlines that volunteered aircraft and crews to assist in the effort. Pan Am dispatched 2 of its own aircraft to aid in the search. Another, Boeing 777 Stratocruiser, loaded with survival supplies that could be dropped to any survivors found in the water, and a Douglas DC-7 with maximum fuel capacity that could remain airborne for up to 16 hours, covering vast stretches of ocean. By the first full day of searching, November 9th, the flotilla had grown to include 8 Coast Guard vessels, 3 Coast Guard aircraft, 2 Navy submarines, 2 merchant ships, 19 military aircraft, and a half-dozen commercial planes. The search area was enormous, over 100,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean, a space larger than the entire state of Oregon. Searchers focused initially on the route between Ocean Station November and Honolulu, assuming that if the aircraft had gone down, it would be somewhere along that flight path. They flew a pattern 150 miles wide and approximately 1,000 miles long, aircraft crisscrossing back and forth, searching for any sign of wreckage, debris, or survivors in the water. To address the possibility that Flight 7's navigation equipment had failed and the aircraft had become lost, the Coast Guard ordered all ships at Pearl Harbor to shine their lights into the sky at night. If the Stratocruiser was still flying, if the crew had somehow managed to keep it in the air but had lost their position, these lights might serve as beacons to guide them to safety. It was a desperate measure, but when 44 lives are at stake, no idea is too desperate to try. Pan Am officials initially expressed confidence that if the Stratocruiser had made a successful ditching, the aircraft's hull would remain intact and the plane would float indefinitely, serving as a life raft for survivors. The successful ditching of Sovereign of the Skies the previous year seemed to support this hope. If Captain Brown and his crew had managed a controlled water landing similar to what Captain Ogg had achieved, there was a chance people were still alive, waiting for rescue. But as days passed with no sign of the aircraft, hope began to fade. The Pacific Ocean is vast beyond human comprehension. An aircraft, even a large one, becomes a tiny speck when surrounded by water in every direction. The search aircraft flew at altitudes that gave them good visibility of the surface, but they could easily miss wreckage or people in the water, especially as weather conditions changed and seas became rougher. Search crews reported hearing radio broadcasts that they initially thought might be distress signals from Flight 7. Each report generated intense activity, with multiple aircraft and ships converging on the source of the transmission. But every report proved to be a false alarm. The radio messages came from other aircraft or ships, not from the missing Stratocruiser. One pilot flying a military air transport plane reported seeing lights on the water at one point during the search. This sighting caused an immediate burst of activity, with multiple resources rushing to investigate. But when search vessels reached the location, they found only a ship, its lights having created the illusion of something else from the air. Families waited for news, desperate for any information about their loved ones. Ken Fortenberry, 6 years old, remembered waking up on Saturday morning, the day after his father's flight disappeared, to find his house full of strangers. His mother had received a call from Pan Am during the night. The airline official had barely said a word before Ken's mother asked, "This is Pan Am calling, isn't it?" She had been having premonitions all day that something was wrong. Ken's mother tried to keep the family's spirits up. "Your dad's a great swimmer, son," she told young Ken, trying to reassure him that his father would survive even if the plane had gone down in the ocean. Ken recalled just being a kid and crying his eyes out, not fully understanding what had happened, but knowing that something terrible had occurred. In San Mateo, young Greg Herkin learned that his former substitute teacher, Marie McGrath, was aboard the missing flight. The news hit the school community hard. McGrath had been loved by students and fellow teachers alike. Now she was gone, vanished somewhere over the Pacific. The families gathered, waiting, hoping, praying for good news that never came. Pan Am officials provided what information they could, but there was precious little to share. The aircraft had made a routine position report. Then, it had simply disappeared. On November 14, 1957, 6 days after Flight 7 vanished, a United States Navy search plane finally spotted something in the water. The crew of the aircraft observed wreckage and bodies floating in the ocean, approximately 940 miles east of Honolulu and 90 miles north of Flight 7's intended track. The aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, already participating in the search, moved to the location and began recovery operations. Small boats deployed from the carrier spread out across a 33 square mile area where debris had been scattered by winds and currents. The scene that greeted the recovery crews was grim. They found 19 bodies floating in the water. 14 of the victims were wearing life jackets from the Stratocruiser. None of the bodies had shoes on. Some victims had external injuries and multiple fractures. One victim was still strapped in a seat, the seat itself having been torn from the aircraft. 3 of the recovered victims had wristwatches that were still functional enough to show when they had stopped. All 3 watches showed times clustered around 5:26 to 5:27 Pacific Standard Time, though exact readings varied slightly between sources. This gave investigators an approximate moment when Clipper Romance of the Skies had impacted the water, roughly 23 minutes after Captain Brown's final position report at 5:04. The wreckage recovered was minimal and provided few clues about what had happened. The largest single piece was a section of bulkhead measuring 4 feet by 7 feet. In total, crews recovered approximately 500 pounds of wreckage from an aircraft that had weighed 147,000 pounds at takeoff. The bulk of the Stratocruiser, along with 25 additional victims, had sunk to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The ocean at that location was approximately 16,500 feet deep, or roughly 3 miles. In 1957, the technology to search at those depths did not exist. The main wreckage of Romance of the Skies would remain on the ocean floor, its secrets locked away in the darkness of the abyss. But even the limited wreckage and bodies that were recovered told investigators some important things about what had happened during those final minutes. The investigation begins. The Civil Aeronautics Board, the predecessor to today's Federal Aviation Administration and National Transportation Safety Board, immediately launched an investigation into the loss of Pan Am Flight 7. The KAB's Bureau of Safety sent investigators to San Francisco to examine every aspect of the flight, from maintenance records to crew qualifications, from weather conditions to passenger screening. The formal hearings began on the morning of January 15, 1958, in a packed conference room at San Francisco's posh Sir Francis Drake Hotel. Over 2 days, 5 investigators from the KB's Bureau of Safety examined 90 exhibits, including personal effects salvaged from the crash site. They questioned 19 witnesses, including maintenance personnel, cargo loaders, and other Pan Am employees who had interacted with the aircraft or crew before departure. The physical evidence recovered from the crash site presented a puzzling picture. The bodies and wreckage clearly showed that Romance of the Skies had struck the water with significant force. All victims had external injuries, and many showed multiple fractures consistent with high-impact trauma. This suggested the aircraft had not gently glided onto the water like Sovereign of the Skies had done the previous year. However, the evidence also suggested that this had not been an uncontrolled high-speed crash. If the Stratocruiser had simply fallen from 10,000 feet in a death dive, hitting the water at hundreds of miles per hour, the wreckage would have shown much more catastrophic damage. The aircraft would have disintegrated on impact, and recovery crews would have found smaller, more fragmented pieces. The fact that 14 of the 19 recovered victims were wearing life jackets was crucial. The life jackets were stored in compartments that required passengers to actively retrieve them. Flight attendants would have had to instruct passengers on how to use them, and likely physically help some passengers put them on. This took time. It required communication. It suggested that the cabin crew knew the aircraft was going down and had time to prepare passengers for a water landing. The missing shoes on all recovered bodies also supported this interpretation. Passengers had removed their shoes, or flight attendants had instructed them to remove their shoes as part of the preparation for ditching. Shoes could be dangerous during an evacuation, making it harder to swim, potentially injuring others in the confined spaces of emergency exits. So the passengers had time to don life jackets and remove shoes. The crew had time to conduct emergency preparation procedures. This meant the emergency did not develop instantly. Something had gone wrong with Romance of the Skies, but whatever it was, it developed over minutes, not seconds. The crew had time to prepare. So why had they not sent a distress call? The investigators examined the maintenance records for Romance of the Skies exhaustively. The CAB concluded that the aircraft, engines, and propellers had been maintained as prescribed and were within their time limitations. The 4 engines had total times ranging from 13,159 hours to 16,961 hours, and all had been overhauled within the last 1,249 hours of flight. On paper, everything looked proper. But investigators knew about the troubled history of the Stratocruiser type. They knew about the propeller problems. They knew about the June 18, 1957 runaway propeller incident on this very aircraft. They knew about the September 19, 1957 mysterious loud noise that had been heard and then dismissed. They knew that maintenance records could say one thing, while the reality might be quite different. The KB found one tantalizing piece of physical evidence among the wreckage: a small section of an engine cowl ring embedded in a scorched pillow. The cowl ring was a metal structure that surrounded the engine. For this piece to be embedded in a pillow suggested that it had been torn from the engine with tremendous force and flung into the cabin. The scorched pillow indicated fire or extreme heat. This single piece of evidence suggested a catastrophic engine failure, possibly a propeller coming apart and penetrating the fuselage, possibly an engine tearing itself from the wing mount. Then there was the carbon monoxide issue. Autopsies performed under the auspices of the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office on the recovered bodies revealed that 4 individuals had higher than normal levels of carbon monoxide in their bloodstream. The elevated levels were not sufficient to have been the cause of death, but they were significant enough to raise questions. Carbon monoxide is an odorless, colorless gas produced by incomplete combustion. In aircraft, it can come from several sources: engine exhaust leaking into the cabin pressurization system, fire, or in rare cases, smoking, though the levels found were too high to be explained by cigarette smoke alone. Most of the victims had died from drowning after the ditching, but the presence of elevated carbon monoxide in some bodies suggested something had been wrong with the aircraft before it hit the water. The KB investigated several theories. Could there have been a fire aboard the aircraft? The wreckage recovered showed burn marks, but these appeared to be confined to the top surfaces of debris above the waterline. This suggested that any burning had occurred after the aircraft was in the water, possibly from fuel spreading across the surface and igniting. There was no evidence of an in-flight fire. Could there have been an explosion? If someone had planted a bomb aboard Romance of the Skies, there would be telltale signs: shattered metal with specific blast patterns, chemical residue, evidence of explosive damage distinct from impact damage. Laboratory examinations of the recovered wreckage found no evidence of explosive materials or bomb damage. If there had been a bomb, it had either left no trace or the evidence had sunk with the main wreckage. The question of sabotage led investigators to examine the passengers more closely. In 1955, just 2 years before Flight 7 disappeared, a man named Jack Gilbert Graham had planted a bomb in his mother's suitcase aboard United Airlines Flight 629. The bomb exploded while the aircraft was in flight over Colorado, killing all 44 people aboard. Graham had purchased flight insurance for his mother at the airport just before departure and stood to benefit from her death. This case had shocked the nation and made airlines and investigators acutely aware that passengers might board flights with murderous intent. Mercury Insurance, which handled flight insurance sales at major airports, reported to investigators that it had carried a total of $230,000 in insurance policies for passengers on Flight 7. The company stated that this amount was not unusual for a flight of this type carrying this number of passengers. But then, nearly a year after the crash, a different story emerged. Western Life Insurance Company of Helena, Montana, revealed that it had refused to pay out a $20,000 life insurance policy purchased shortly before the flight by one of the passengers, William Harrison Payne. The insurance company pointed out that Payne's body had not been recovered. There was no witness who had actually seen Payne board the aircraft. The airline could not definitively prove he had been on the flight. Given Payne's financial troubles, his explosives expertise, his purchase of multiple life insurance policies totaling $145,000 just days before the flight, and his claim that he was traveling to collect a debt that was worth less than the cost of his ticket, Western Life suspected fraud. Pan Am admitted to insurance investigators that yes, it was theoretically possible that Payne had purchased a ticket, checked in for the flight, but never actually boarded the aircraft. This would have required him to slip away during boarding, but it was not impossible. The airline's passenger manifest showed Payne as having boarded, but that manifest was based on ticket verification at check-in, not on physically counting passengers as they entered the aircraft. Russell Stiles, an investigator for Western Life Insurance, became convinced that William Harrison Payne had brought down Romance of the Skies to collect insurance money and had not actually been aboard when the aircraft crashed. Stiles investigated Payne's background thoroughly. He discovered the dynamite incident with the logging trucks. He learned about the shooting of a business associate. He found witnesses who said Payne had boasted about being able to build a delayed action detonator. Stiles presented his findings to the FBI, hoping the federal agency would launch a criminal investigation. But J. Edgar Hoover's FBI showed no interest. The case was too complex, too uncertain, with too little physical evidence. If the FBI launched an investigation and failed to solve it, that failure would reflect badly on the Bureau. Hoover built his reputation on success, not on taking on impossible cases. The FBI rebuffed Stiles's requests. Frustrated but determined, Stiles alerted a crime reporter at a local newspaper. The story of the suspicious insurance purchases and Payne's explosive expertise made headlines, but without federal law enforcement interest, the investigation went nowhere. Western Life Insurance initially refused to pay the claim to Payne's widow, Harriet. When Harriet threatened to sue, the insurance company capitulated and paid the full amount of the double indemnity policy. Then, in June 1958, 7 months after the crash, something extremely suspicious occurred. The Roxbury Lodge, William Harrison Payne's heavily insured hunting lodge, burned to the ground. The fire occurred while Harriet Payne was in Mexico on her honeymoon after marrying a friend and former neighbor of her late husband. Authorities suspected arson but could not prove it. The insurance underwriters, faced with the prospect of another lawsuit, quietly agreed to settle the claim. Meanwhile, the postmistress in Scott's Bar told Russell Stiles something strange. Harriet Payne and her new husband had begun receiving mysterious letters and packages from overseas. There was never a return address on these mailings. The postmistress found it odd enough to mention it to the investigator. Stiles became convinced that William Harrison Payne might still be alive, theorizing that he could have staged his own death by planting a bomb on Flight 7, collected the insurance money through his wife, and was possibly living somewhere overseas, periodically sending packages and letters to Harriet. This remained speculation, based on circumstantial evidence and the investigators' interpretation of suspicious events. Stiles continued investigating on his own, using his personal funds even after retiring from Western life. According to his daughter, until the day he died in March 1999, Russell Stiles feared that he would answer his door one day and find William Harrison Payne standing there, seeking revenge for the investigation. But Pan Am had its own suspect, and the airline suspected one of its own employees. Eugene Crosthwaite, the purser, had shown a copy of his changed will to be found in his car at the airport, suggesting he knew he was not coming back. He had shown blasting powder to his father-in-law shortly before the flight, blasting powder that investigators could not find after the crash. He had called the sheriff's office to accuse his stepdaughter of causing his wife's death. He had a documented history of psychological issues severe enough that local police referred to him as psycho. He held grudges against Pan Am for perceived mistreatment dating back years. He had bragged about deliberately contaminating food before serving it to a captain he felt had insulted him. When Pan Am officials reviewed all this information, the evidence pointed toward Crosthwaite as a potential suspect. The changed will left conspicuously in his car, the blasting powder shown to witnesses, and his documented psychological struggles created a troubling pattern. The airline requested that the FBI investigate Crosthwaite as a possible perpetrator of what might have been a deliberate act. The FBI declined. The Civil Aeronautics Board assigned one of its investigators, Claude Schonberger, to look into Crosthwaite's background. Schonberger's investigation uncovered the blasting powder story and documented the changes to Crosthwaite's will. He interviewed the sheriff, who testified that Crosthwaite's stepdaughter Tanya thought it was probable that her stepfather might have taken his life and destroyed the 44 people on the flight because he was too chicken to go alone. But without more physical evidence, without the main wreckage, without any definitive proof of how the aircraft came down, no conclusion could be reached about Crosthwaite's role, if any, in the disaster. And then there was the matter of the radio transmission. The mysterious radio transmission. Among all the evidence and testimony examined during the investigation, one of the most controversial issues involved what may or may not have been heard on radio recordings from the day Flight 7 disappeared. In the 1950s, before cockpit voice recorders became standard equipment, radio communications between aircraft and air traffic control stations were recorded by a company called Aeronautical Radio Incorporated, commonly known as AR Inc. AR Inc. maintained receiving stations at major airports and communication centers, and these stations automatically recorded all radio transmissions on the frequencies they monitored. On November 8, 1957, AR Inc. receiving stations in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle were monitoring the frequencies used by transoceanic flights. All transmissions on those frequencies that day, including Captain Brown's routine 404 position report from Romance of the Skies, were recorded on magnetic tape. After Flight 7 disappeared, investigators knew these recordings might contain crucial information. If the crew had sent any kind of distress call, even a weak or garbled one, it would be on those tapes. AR Inc. turned over the recordings to the Civil Aeronautics Board. On the second day of the hearings in San Francisco, CAB investigators considered the possibility that the crew of Flight 7 had sent a distress call that had not been clearly heard or recognized in real time. Several factors could have prevented a distress call from being received clearly. A severed antenna if an engine or propeller had struck the fuselage, damage to the aircraft's radio equipment, or interference from atmospheric conditions. The CAB gathered the AR Inc. recordings and sent them to audio experts at Bell Laboratories for examination. Bell Labs represented the cutting edge of audio analysis technology in 1958. If anyone could extract a message from these recordings, Bell's engineers could. After careful analysis, Bell Labs reported that they had found something. Approximately 15 minutes after Clipper Romance of the Sky's last routine radio report, the engineers had detected a distorted message containing the words 44. These words could refer to the aircraft's Pan Am designation, 944, the last 3 digits of the registration number, N90944. The Bell Labs engineers prepared a transcript of what they believed they heard on the tapes. The transcript described a garbled transmission that seemed to include navigation terms and possibly indicators of an emergency situation. But the audio quality was poor, the words faint and unclear, overlapping with static and interference. The Civil Aeronautics Board then asked a group of Pan Am pilots who were personal friends of the missing crew to listen to the recordings. If anyone could determine whether the transmission had come from Romance of the Skies, it would be other Pan Am pilots who knew the crew members' voices and who understood the terminology and procedures used on transoceanic flights. The Pan Am pilots listened to the tapes carefully. They reported that the recordings did contain a message of some kind, but the words were faint and either indecipherable or nonsensical. More troubling, the pilots stated that the majority of the words and phrases used in the message were foreign to their radio telephone practices. Certain words were clearly not appropriate to the situation under investigation. The pilots concluded that it was unlikely that the message originated from Pan Am Flight 7. In their official report, the CAB's investigators expressed certainty on this point. No radio message was received from the aircraft after the emergency situation began. But had the investigators gotten this wrong? The existence of the Bell Labs analysis and the transcript suggested there had been something on those recordings, something that required experts to analyze and attempt to decipher. If it was not from Flight 7, what aircraft had it come from? Why had it occurred approximately 15 minutes after Flight 7's last position report, exactly when an emergency would have been developing? The controversy over the possible radio transmission would haunt the investigation for decades. The AR Inc. tapes themselves, the actual physical recordings that might definitively answer the question, disappeared at some point after the investigation concluded. Whether they were destroyed intentionally, lost accidentally, or filed away in some archive where they still wait to be rediscovered remains unknown. Former Pan Am employees who later researched the case told investigators that there should be a tape recording of a radio transmission from an aircraft flying above the Pacific during the day of the tragedy, a tape that supposedly includes one last desperate Mayday call, likely from Romance of the Skies. If such a recording exists, it may be in the Pan Am archives that were transferred to the University of Miami after the airline ceased operations in 1991. Those archives consist of approximately 1,000 boxes of material, largely unprocessed and off-limits to researchers for years. The archivists estimated it would take at least 3 years to catalog and organize the collection before making it available to researchers. Inside those boxes could be the maintenance records for Romance of the Skies, showing whether the May 1957 Airworthiness Directive had been properly completed. Inside those boxes could be Pan Am's internal investigation file on Eugene Crosthwaite. And inside those boxes could be the audio tape or transcript that finally explains what happened during those final minutes. The final report. After months of investigation, interviews, analysis, and debate, the Civil Aeronautics Board prepared its final report on the loss of Pan Am Flight 7. The document, released in January 1959, more than a year after the crash, delivered the conclusion that families had feared: insufficient tangible evidence at this time to determine the cause of the accident. The CAB's investigators laid out everything they knew. The aircraft had been properly maintained according to records. The crew was experienced and qualified. The weather had been favorable. The last position report indicated everything was normal. Then, 23 minutes later, the aircraft hit the water approximately 90 miles north of its intended track. The physical evidence suggested the passengers had time to prepare for a ditching. The elevated carbon monoxide levels in some bodies suggested something had been wrong with the aircraft systems. The recovered piece of scorched cowl ring embedded in a pillow suggested possible catastrophic engine failure. But none of this evidence was sufficient to determine exactly what had caused the emergency. The report acknowledged the suspicions surrounding both William Harrison Payne and Eugene Crosthwaite. It noted Payne's insurance purchases, his explosives expertise, and the fact that his body had not been recovered. It noted Crosthwaite's changed will, his display of blasting powder, and his troubled psychological state. But laboratory examination had ruled out a bomb explosion. There was no definitive evidence that either man had sabotaged the flight. The possibility of mechanical failure, specifically propeller or engine failure, similar to what had afflicted other Stratocruisers, remained the most likely explanation. But without recovering the main wreckage, without examining the engines and propellers, this theory could not be proven. James Durfee, the head of the Civil Aeronautics Board, did something unusual. He officially dissented from his own organization's report. Durfee wrote that he was not satisfied with the language, the discussion, or the findings with respect to Pan Am's maintenance practices. He noted that the Civil Aeronautics Authority, the CAB's parent organization, had not reprimanded Pan Am for its maintenance deficiencies, nor ensured that those deficiencies had been corrected. Durfee understood something important. The Civil Aeronautics Authority had a built-in conflict of interest. The same agency responsible for investigating commercial aviation accidents was also charged with promoting aviation to the public. CAA and CAB officials were routinely given free tickets by the major airlines and were wined and dined by the companies they were supposed to oversee. This cozy relationship made it difficult to issue harsh findings against airlines, especially large influential ones like Pan Am. An attorney representing Pan Am, J.J. Cantwell, had written to KAB official Robert Crisp in May 1958 to protest plans to cite Pan Am's lax maintenance in the government's report. In a separate letter to Pan Am's legal department, Cantwell frankly admitted that he hoped to persuade Crisp to withhold the maintenance report from the public record. The relationship between regulators and the industry they regulated was simply too close. The investigation of Flight 7 suffered as a result. Critical questions remained unanswered because investigators lacked either the evidence or the institutional will to push for definitive answers. For the families of the victims, the final report brought no closure, no justice, no peace. Insufficient tangible evidence meant their loved ones had disappeared, died, but nobody could explain why or how, or who might be responsible. 6-year-old Ken Fortenberry learned that he would never know for certain what had happened to his father. At age 13, Ken wrote a letter to the Civil Aeronautics Board asking if there had been any progress on the case. He received what he later described as a bureaucratic BS response, essentially telling him that nothing had been done on the case in 7 years and nothing was planned. Ken remembered walking back to his house from the mailbox, mad as hell. At that moment, he made a vow. He was going to find out what happened to that plane if it took him the rest of his life. Young Greg Herkin, whose substitute teacher Marie McGrath had perished on the flight, would grow up to become a history professor and curator at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. In 1988, while working at the museum, Herkin realized that the National Transportation Safety Board, the successor to the Civil Aeronautics Board, was located right across the street. He decided to see if he could discover what had really happened to Marie McGrath's plane. He discovered that Flight 7 was considered one of the outstanding aviation mysteries. 2 boys, connected to the tragedy in different ways, would devote much of their lives to solving a mystery that the official investigation had failed to resolve. Decades of investigation. Ken Fortenberry pursued journalism as a career, eventually becoming an award-winning investigative reporter. Over the course of more than 40 years in the newspaper business, He earned over 200 state, regional, and national awards for excellence in journalism. His work exposing corruption in local law enforcement in McCormick, South Carolina, led to a federal prison term for the sheriff, the bribery conviction of the sheriff's replacement, and the exposure of the chief deputy as an ex-convict. His house was bombed twice because of the stories he published. He wrote a book about the experience called Kill the Messenger. But throughout his successful career, Ken never forgot the vow he had made at age 13. He continued investigating his father's death, following every lead, tracking down every witness, examining every document he could find. The advent of the internet in the 1990s transformed his investigation, making it possible to locate people and information that had been nearly impossible to find before. Greg Herkin pursued academia, earning a doctorate and becoming a respected history professor. His specialty was the history of technology and science, but he maintained a deep interest in the mystery of Flight 7. When he began working at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in 1988, he gained access to resources and aviation expertise that allowed him to research the case in new ways. Around 2000, about 20 years ago, Ken posted a request for information on an online message board dedicated to Pan American Airways. Greg saw the post and responded. The two men discovered they had been investigating the same case independently for decades. Greg flew to North Carolina to meet Ken in person. They realized immediately that they could accomplish far more working together than either could alone. Over the next 2 decades, Ken and Greg became the world's leading experts on Pan Am Flight 7. They tracked down witnesses who had never been interviewed by the original investigation. They located documents that had been filed away and forgotten. They interviewed family members of passengers and crew, piecing together details about the people aboard the aircraft and what might have motivated any of them to harm the flight. In 2014, thanks to a grant from the Pan Am Historical Foundation, Ken and Greg finally gained access to the Pan Am archives at the University of Miami. It had taken not the predicted 3 years, but 10 years for the collection to be processed and open to researchers. Inside those 1,000 boxes, Ken and Greg found evidence that transformed their understanding of the case. They discovered the transcript of the KAB hearings, 367 pages documenting the investigation in detail. More importantly, they found the overlooked evidence they had been told about for years, an analysis of what was on the AR Inc. recordings conducted after the official hearings had closed. What they discovered was evidence of collusion, complicity, and cover-up in the government's investigation of the tragedy. The Bell Labs analysis had been more detailed than publicly acknowledged. The transcript of the possible Mayday call had been more specific than officials had admitted. The pressure from Pan Am to influence the final report had been more intense than anyone outside the investigation had known. Ken and Greg also found documents showing that some KB investigators had suspected mechanical failure, but had been prevented from pursuing that line of investigation aggressively because it would have meant criticizing Pan Am's maintenance practices. The cozy relationship between regulators and the airline industry had compromised the integrity of the investigation. The two investigators published their findings in a lengthy article for Air and Space Smithsonian Magazine in 2004. The article, titled "The Mystery of the Lost Clipper," laid out the evidence they had uncovered and presented their conclusion. Romance of the Skies had most likely suffered a catastrophic propeller failure, similar to what had afflicted other Stratocruisers. The crew had struggled to control the aircraft, but ultimately had been forced to ditch. The carbon monoxide had likely come from engine exhaust, leaking into the cabin through battle damage caused by propeller fragments penetrating the fuselage. But Ken Fortenberry was not satisfied with this conclusion. He continued investigating, and his focus increasingly turned to Eugene Crosthwaite. For decades, Ken had tried to contact Crosthwaite's stepdaughter, Tanya. He wanted to learn more about her stepfather's state of mind in the days before the EA-Sharbi flight. But Tanya, as Ken later put it, stiffed him for decades. She refused to respond to letters, refused phone calls, avoided all contact. Then, one day, Ken received a Facebook message. "I think it's about time we talk." Ken immediately flew to Houston to meet Tanya. What she told him changed everything. According to Ken, Tanya laid it out that her stepdad was suicidal and out of his mind in the weeks before the flight. She provided details about Crosthwaite's psychological state, his treatment of her, his anger and depression following his wife's death, his resentment toward Pan Am. The information helped Ken form a clearer picture of a man who might have been capable of mass murder-suicide. Ken consulted with a forensic psychologist, providing all the information he had gathered about Crosthwaite. The psychologist's analysis concluded that Crosthwaite fit the profile of someone who might commit such an act. Profound depression following the loss of his wife, anger directed at others whom he blamed for his troubles, access to the means to destroy the aircraft, and the will changes and blasting powder display, suggesting someone preparing for death while ensuring that at least one person would suspect what he had done. In 2020, Ken published a book presenting his conclusion, "Flight 7 is Missing: The Search for My Father's Killer." The title made Ken's position clear. He had concluded that his father and 43 others had been murdered by Eugene Crosthwaite. The book laid out all the evidence Ken had gathered over nearly 60 years of investigation. It presented a compelling case, though it acknowledged that without physical evidence, without recovering the main wreckage, absolute proof remained impossible. Greg Herkin, while respecting Ken's conclusion, reached a different determination. Greg still believed the most likely explanation was catastrophic mechanical failure. The Stratocruiser's history of propeller problems, the previous incidents involving Romance of the Skies herself, the piece of scorched cowl ring, and the pattern of similar accidents involving other Stratocruisers all pointed to mechanical failure rather than sabotage. The two men, who had worked together for 2 decades, agreed to disagree on the final conclusion. But both agreed on several fundamental points. The official investigation had been inadequate, the families of the victims deserved better answers, and the story of Flight 7 represented important lessons about aviation safety, regulatory oversight, and the human cost of cutting corners. The evidence examined. What really happened to Pan Am Flight 7? Can we ever know for certain what caused Romance of the Skies to fall from the sky that November day in 1957? Let us examine the evidence piece by piece and consider the theories that have been proposed. The mechanical failure theory suggests that Romance of the Skies suffered a catastrophic propeller or engine failure, similar to what had afflicted other Stratocruisers. The evidence supporting this theory includes the previous runaway propeller incident on June 18, 1957, involving this exact aircraft. The mysterious loud noise heard on September 19, 1957, which might have been an early warning of propeller or engine problems. The piece of scorched engine cowl ring embedded in a pillow, suggesting an engine component had been torn loose with tremendous force and had penetrated the cabin. The history of propeller failures on other Stratocruisers, including incidents that caused engine separation and crashes. The fact that Romance of the Skies had continued flying for 23 minutes after the last position report suggests the crew was struggling with a controllable but worsening emergency rather than facing instant catastrophe. The elevated carbon monoxide levels suggested the possibility of engine exhaust leaking into the cabin pressurization system through damage caused by propeller fragments, though other explanations could not be ruled out. The aircraft being found 90 miles north of its intended track indicated the crew may have been unable to maintain their planned course, which would be consistent with an aircraft suffering from asymmetric thrust or other control difficulties due to engine problems. Against this theory, if the problem was mechanical, why did the crew not send a distress call? Even if the radio antenna had been damaged, the crew should have had at least a few minutes to transmit a message before the damage occurred. The Bell Labs analysis suggesting a possible transmission 15 minutes after the last position report could support the mechanical failure theory if that transmission did come from Flight 7. But the Pan Am pilots who listened to the recordings did not believe it originated from the missing aircraft. The Crosthwaite murder-suicide theory suggests that the purser deliberately brought down the aircraft, killing himself and 43 others. The evidence supporting this theory includes Crosthwaite's changed will, left where it would be found. The display of blasting powder to his father-in-law shortly before the flight, followed by the inability to locate any explosives on his property after the crash. His documented psychological problems, including being described as psycho by local police. His depression following his wife's death 3 months earlier. His troubled relationship with his stepdaughter, whom he blamed for his wife's death. His long-standing resentment toward Pan Am. His documented erratic behavior and bragging about contaminating food served to a captain. His stepdaughter's statement that she thought it probable he might have taken his life and destroyed the 44 people on the flight because he was too chicken to go alone. The lack of a distress call could be explained if Crosthwaite had somehow incapacitated the cockpit crew or prevented them from reaching the radio. Against this theory, laboratory examination of recovered wreckage found no evidence of explosive materials or bomb damage. If Crosthwaite had used explosives to bring down the aircraft, there should have been chemical residue, blast patterns, or other forensic evidence. As a purser, Crosthwaite had limited access to the cockpit and limited technical knowledge of how to sabotage the aircraft systems. The blasting powder story comes from a single witness, and no explosives were found, raising the question of whether Crosthwaite actually had access to such materials, or whether his father-in-law misremembered or misinterpreted what he saw. The passengers had time to don life jackets, suggesting the emergency developed over minutes, which seems inconsistent with a sudden bomb explosion. The Payne insurance fraud theory suggests that William Harrison Payne planted a bomb with a timer on the aircraft, then somehow avoided boarding, staging his own death to collect the insurance money through his wife. The evidence supporting this theory includes Payne's purchase of 3 life insurance policies totaling $145,000 just days before the flight, including a double indemnity policy purchased 4 days before departure. His financial desperation, owing $10,000 on a failing hunting lodge facing foreclosure. His expertise with explosives as a former Navy frogman. His history of violent behavior, including using dynamite to destroy a road and shooting at a business associate. His claim that he was traveling to collect a $10,000 debt that was worth less than his one-way ticket cost, with no one in his family knowing who owed him money. His boasting about being able to build a delayed action detonator using wire and batteries. The fact that his body was never found among the recovered victims. Pan Am officials admitting it was possible he had not actually boarded. The subsequent burning of his heavily insured hunting lodge 7 months after the crash while his widow was on her honeymoon with her new husband. The mysterious packages and letters from overseas received by his widow and new husband. Russell Stiles' investigation concluding Payne was likely still alive. Against this theory, laboratory examination found no evidence of explosive materials or bomb damage on recovered wreckage. Airline manifests showed Payne as having checked in and boarded, though these records were not infallible. The FBI investigated Payne as a possible suspect and eventually concluded he was likely dead, even listing him as a suspect in later aircraft bombings, only because they were attempting to determine if he was still alive. The insurance companies ultimately paid the claims, suggesting they became convinced Payne had actually died on the flight. If Payne had staged the bombing and his own disappearance, he would have had to coordinate with his wife or convince her to participate in insurance fraud without her knowing he was alive, both scenarios presenting significant complications. There are other theories that have been proposed over the years. Some have suggested Chinese intelligence involvement, noting that this was during the Cold War and that a U.S. Air Force major aboard the flight was reportedly traveling to Burma on a secret mission. Could Chinese agents have sabotaged the flight in retaliation for some CIA operation? The problem with this theory is the lack of any evidence connecting Chinese intelligence to the incident, and the question of how foreign agents would have gained access to the aircraft. Some UFO enthusiasts have suggested extraterrestrial involvement, noting that the week of the crash was reportedly one of the most prolific in UFO sighting history, and that William Fortenberry himself had reported a UFO sighting during a flight in 1952. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and there is no credible evidence of UFO involvement in the crash. The most plausible explanation, based on the available evidence, appears to involve some combination of the mechanical failure theory and possibly the Crosthwaite theory, though certainty remains elusive. The Stratocruiser's documented propeller problems, the previous incidents involving this specific aircraft, and the physical evidence of the cowl ring fragment all point toward mechanical failure as a likely initiating event. The elevated carbon monoxide, the absence of a clear distress call, and the circumstances surrounding Crosthwaite raise questions about whether a mechanical emergency might have been compounded by other factors. However, this remains in the realm of informed speculation rather than proven fact. But in the end, without recovering the main wreckage from the ocean floor, without examining the engines and propellers, without finding physical evidence of what caused the emergency, we cannot know with certainty what happened during those final 23 minutes. The legacy Pan Am Flight 7 remains officially unsolved to this day. The Civil Aeronautics Board's conclusion of insufficient tangible evidence has never been overturned or superseded by a more definitive finding. The case file is closed but not resolved. The tragedy claimed 44 lives, 36 passengers and 8 crew members. Among them were business executives, a vice president of Renault, a U.S. Air Force officer on a secret mission, a man traveling to collect a mysterious debt, a purser with psychological problems, a registered nurse flying to care for her mother, a repairman visiting his ill father, a father traveling to attend his mother's funeral, families with children, and 4 highly trained aviators who had devoted their lives to the profession of flying. The families of the victims have lived for over 6 decades without complete answers. Some, like Ken Fortenberry, devoted their lives to finding those answers. Others eventually made peace with the uncertainty, accepting that some questions may never be answered. On April 4, 2023, a memorial was unveiled at the Millbrae Historical Society near San Francisco International Airport. The granite marker bears the names of all 44 passengers and crew members lost on Pan Am Flight 7. The Pan Am Flight 7 Memorial Committee, made up of relatives of those lost in the crash, organized the memorial. Ken Fortenberry attended the ceremony, finally seeing his father's name properly honored alongside the others who perished that day. The inscription reads, "In memory of the 44 lives lost on November 8, 1957, when Pan American Boeing Stratocruiser N90944, operating as Flight 7 from San Francisco International Airport, crashed in the Pacific Ocean en route to Honolulu, Hawaii, near the point of no return." The phrase "near the point of no return" is significant. In aviation, the point of no return is the moment when an aircraft has flown far enough that it no longer has sufficient fuel to return to its departure point. Beyond that point, the only choice is to continue forward to the destination. Flight 7 had passed its point of no return when the emergency developed. Captain Brown and his crew had no choice but to try to make it to Hawaii or ditch in the ocean. They did not make it to Hawaii. The loss of Pan Am Flight 7, combined with other Stratocruiser accidents and the increasing awareness of aviation safety issues contributed to significant changes in how aircraft were designed, maintained, and regulated. The Federal Aviation Agency was created in 1958, just months after Flight 7 disappeared, giving the government stronger oversight authority over airline operations and maintenance. The FAA later became the Federal Aviation Administration in 1967. The Civil Aeronautics Board's failure to reach a definitive conclusion about Flight 7 highlighted the problems with having the same agency responsible for both promoting aviation and investigating accidents. This conflict of interest was eventually resolved by creating the National Transportation Safety Board as an independent agency in 1967. Propeller technology improved dramatically in the years following the Stratocruiser's troubled operational history. Aircraft manufacturers and engine companies invested heavily in developing more reliable propeller control systems and stronger propeller blades. The advent of the jet age, beginning with aircraft like the Boeing 707 in 1958, eventually made the Stratocruiser and its generation of piston-powered airliners obsolete. Of the 56 Boeing 377 Stratocruisers built, including the single prototype, Pan Am alone lost 7 in accidents. The type's accident rate was appalling, approximately 16% hull loss rate. By the early 1960s, all Stratocruisers had been retired from passenger service, replaced by jets that were faster, more reliable, and more economical to operate. Today, no complete Stratocruiser survives. The last one was scrapped. The person who owned it, not realizing it, was the final example of its type. A few modified Stratocruisers exist, converted into oversized cargo carriers with bulbous fuselages that earned them the nickname Guppy. These aircraft were used to transport rocket stages for the space program. Some examples survive in museums. The ocean, where Romance of the Skies went down, continues to guard its secrets. At approximately 16,500 feet deep, the wreckage lies far beyond the reach of most underwater exploration technology. Modern submersibles and robotic vehicles could potentially reach the wreck site, but the cost would be enormous, and the exact location is not known with precision. The debris field recovered on the surface was spread over 33 square miles by currents and wind. The main wreckage could be anywhere in a much larger area. Some have suggested using modern technology to search for the wreck. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sonar and cameras could, in theory, search the seabed in the general area where the aircraft is believed to have gone down. If the main wreckage could be found and examined, many questions could finally be answered. The engines and propellers could be examined for evidence of mechanical failure. The fuselage structure could be checked for evidence of explosion or fire. The cockpit could potentially reveal information about the crew's final actions. But such an expedition would cost millions of dollars and would require months of searching in one of the most remote parts of the Pacific Ocean. Without government funding or a commitment from a major research institution, it is unlikely to happen. The families of the victims deserve answers, but after more than 6 decades, the trail has gone cold. Conclusion. On November 8, 1957, 44 people boarded a luxurious aircraft that promised to carry them across the Pacific in comfort and style. They settled into spacious seats, anticipated 7-course meals and champagne service, and looked forward to arriving in Hawaii after a pleasant 10-hour flight. 23 minutes after sending a routine position report indicating that everything was normal, Clipper Romance of the Skies struck the Pacific Ocean with sufficient force to kill most of those aboard on impact. Those who survived the initial impact drowned in the minutes that followed, despite having life jackets on, despite the crew's best efforts to prepare them for ditching. Why did it happen? Was it a catastrophic mechanical failure? The inevitable result of pushing piston engine technology to its limits and then not maintaining it properly? Was it murder-suicide by a disturbed purser who decided to take 43 people with him into death because he was too chicken to go alone? Was it insurance fraud by a desperate man with explosives expertise and massive debts? We may never know for certain. What we do know is that 44 people died, leaving behind families who deserved answers they never received. We know that the official investigation was compromised by conflicts of interest and institutional pressures that prevented investigators from pursuing the truth wherever it led. We know that 2 boys, connected to the tragedy in different ways, grew into men who devoted decades of their lives to finding answers that the official investigation had failed to provide. We know that aviation is safer today, in part because of lessons learned from tragedies like Pan Am Flight 7. The changes in regulation, oversight, and technology that followed this disaster, and others like it, have made flying the safest form of transportation in human history. But we also know that somewhere on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, approximately 16,500 feet below the surface and 90 miles north of the intended flight track, lies the shattered wreckage of Romance of the Skies. Inside that wreckage, locked in the cold darkness of the abyss, are the answers to questions that have haunted investigators, family members, and aviation historians for more than 6 decades. The main engines are down there, their propellers either attached or torn away, the evidence of what went wrong preserved in metal and machinery that no one has seen since November 8, 1957. The cockpit instruments are down there, frozen at the readings they showed in those final moments. The bodies of 25 victims are down there, still strapped in their seats or floating in the flooded cabin, their remains providing silent testimony to whatever horror unfolded during those last 23 minutes. Perhaps someday, technology will advance to the point where we can mount an expedition to find and examine the wreckage. Perhaps someday, we will definitively answer whether this was accident or murder. Perhaps someday, the families of the victims will finally have the closure they deserve. Until then, the mystery of Pan Am Flight 7 remains one of aviation's most haunting unsolved cases. Romance of the Skies, the aircraft that promised luxury and adventure, instead became a tomb for 44 souls who vanished over the Pacific on a November afternoon in 1957. The mystery endures. The questions remain. And in the cold depths of the Pacific Ocean, the answers wait in darkness. If you found this deep dive into the mysteries of forgotten history compelling, please consider subscribing to Lore 2 Mystery. We explore the forgotten tragedies, unsolved mysteries, and lost stories that deserve to be remembered. Your subscription helps us continue bringing respectful, thoroughly researched content to those who sleep to these tales of mystery and intrigue. Until next time, remember that every mystery unsolved is a story unfinished, waiting for someone to care enough to seek the truth. Good night and sweet dreams.